English translation. 600 First Contact Tuesday, the 10th of November, 2014, 21:54 hours.
You surprise me, but be welcomed, and so be my greetings to you. But it is good that you come, because I have a lot to talk to you about. But I also have questions.
I also greet you, my friend. What do you have?
See here, these pages with the 49 rules of the FIGU core groups, national groups, and study groups written by a passive member. Please read them and then tell me what you think.
Tar reads.
I find the writing completely inappropriate and an intervention in the competencies of the core group. If such rules are to be created, then this does not apply to the passive group members, which is why I find the whole thing presumptuous.
You're saying something like what I think you're saying. In my opinion, these rules, which I do not consider to be bad, but which I nevertheless regard as a matter of fact, can be judged in such a way that, on the one hand, they appear dictatorial, and on the other hand, in a form that is fair to the FIGU, they would really belong in the competence of the core group, as you yourself have said.
The whole formulation is such that the fact emerges from it that it is possible to discern in it an attitude of power, as unfortunately has to be observed again and again with very many Earth humans, especially also in connection with groupings, etc., in which a leading role wants to be introduced. This is also the reason why you had to dissolve a FIGU group 3 times in the USA and once in Japan. Because they had hierarchical traits, and certain members became dominant and demanding and believed that they could set themselves as leaders over the other members in a controlling and dictatorial way. But this cannot be allowed in any case, because the rules of the FIGU stipulate that only one entire group can issue regulations at a time, and that all members, including those who hold office, are absolutely equal in every respect. So it is in no way acceptable that one FIGU member, neither a core group member nor a passive member, rises above another and gives it any orders or dictates things, because in any case the voluntariness to do any work or thing, etc., must always be given. And what is offered in these 49 rules corresponds to a dictatorial opposite of freedom and voluntariness, for the whole is composed in a way that unmistakably has a power-hungry form.
In my opinion, all that is written here as a 49-point article could be incorporated into a factual article for the Aquarius magazine or a bulletin, but not as a form of dictatorial rules for the FIGU groups.
Which I can only agree with you.
Well, then we're in agreement. Then I have another question concerning the saga The Pied Piper of Hameln. Marianne and I have discussed this recently, but we could not make sense of what is really behind this legend. And since I am also personally interested in this saga story, I would like to ask you if you know anything about this saga, and if so, what is its origin? For my part, I assume that there must be a true little word in this saga somewhere, as is the case with many sagas and legends, but also with many fairy tales. Many actual events, happenings, and situations have been used since time immemorial to use them imaginatively in legends, fairy tales, and legends.
This is absolutely true, because as a rule, some fairy tale stories are based on certain actual causes, just as legends and legends are based on certain actual causes. I know the story, or rather the Pied Piper saga, because my father Svath also dealt with it and got to the bottom of it all, whereby he was able to reveal through a review of the past that this saga in relation to the Pied Piper saga is nothing more than a fairy tale which was put together from 2 different sagas. So here's what I can say. The origin and the core of this Pied Piper saga has nothing to do with a flute player or anything like that, who first removed rats from Hamelin and then was cheated of his wages. It is also a fact that there was no child exodus from Hamelin, because the effective truth is different. On June 26, 1284, young people were led away from Hameln because they had committed themselves some time before through an advertising process to emigrate to distant and sparsely populated areas. So the recruitment did not take place on the same day as the young people moved away. But 2 weeks earlier, when they were all able to tie up their bundles and take their belongings with them when they left on the 26th of June, 1284. At that time, as well as earlier and even later, it was customary for men hired by rulers, emperors, kings, or aristocratic territorial rulers, to cross the country with drums and flutes and to drum up the people with the participation of foreign flute players. The purpose, which these envoys of the country nobles, etc., had to fulfill, who went along in very noticeable, colorful clothes and from village to village and from city to city traveled, was, with their flute playing and the drumming, to gather the people around themselves and to promise the interested ones much more, besides often much more, than it corresponded in the end to the reality. As a rule, young people were recruited and promised a good life. The purpose of recruiting young people was different in each case, for example, to recruit for military service and for war purposes, but also to carry out certain work or frontline duties. Also to the settlement of certain areas. The ruling powerful sent out advertising drummers and advertising flute players to recruit emigrants for the purpose of settling in only sparsely populated foreign areas. And indeed, at that time was the time of the high medieval colonization of the eastern territories of Germany, which is why landed nobles in many villages and towns were looking for emigrating young settlers for their distant possessions. This was also the case in Hamelin, where 130 young, adult humans, women and men, that is to say, no children, went out with a drummer and a flute player through a drummer and a flute player, in order to make their fortune elsewhere, just in the way of settling distant areas in the east of the country. So on the 12th of June, 1284, 130 young humans were recruited in Hameln, who then left their hometown, set off and settled in a distant and sparsely populated area, mainly in today's Brandenburg, and created a new home for themselves. At that time, a man with a drum and a man with a flute actually led the young people away from Hameln, but in a different way than the Pied Piper saga reports. The departure of the young but already adult humans took place on the 26th of June, 1284, whereby this event was held on a house beam in Hameln, on which approximately the following can be read: Anno 1284 at the Dage Johannes et Pauli was the 26th of June. Furthermore, in an old city book of Hameln, there is a handwritten dating edition which reads as follows: After our children's departure in 1284. In no wise is there any mention of underage children, nor of rats or a rat catcher who has removed these animals from Hameln and then been cheated of his wages. So the Pied Piper saga, the Pied Piper of Hameln, has a completely different origin than the fact that a man with a flute expelled the rats from Hameln, because in fact 2 men were significantly involved in this matter, such as an advertising drummer and an advertising flute player, who together with their drumming and flute playing recruited young adults who then emigrated and settled new areas in the east of the country. The false saga, the Pied Piper of Hameln, did not come into being until the end of the 16th century, when 2 different and originally independent sagas were linked together.
Thanks for the clarification. Then I wrote here a longer article about the consequences of overpopulation, because a certain Werner Booty made a film with the title Population Boom, which was discussed with an article in a consumer magazine and was obviously also shown on television. Booty denies in his film the overpopulation and claims crazy that the only problem is the wrong distribution of food and resources, but not the population of Earth, which he says that if all mankind is set up in Austria, it will still have square kilometers of space for another billion people. The man in no way sees neither reality nor its truth. If you want to read my article, or at least have a quick look at it.
But that takes some time because the article is extensive, I see.
He is, yeah. But you can take your time to read, because in the meantime I can work on the computer and do some things that need to be done.
Then I would like to turn to the article.
Reads,
Consequences of overpopulation.
Unfortunately, there was no listening to the predictions and warnings that I sent hundreds and thousands of copies to governments, newspapers, journals, radio, and TV stations in the 1950s and later decades. In all the predictive relationships mentioned, the old style was continued throughout the world, and irresponsible efforts were made to ensure that everything came to pass as predicted. They have been happening for some time, even decades. And unfortunately, the process is now unstoppable because everything is far too advanced for valuable countermeasures to be taken against the worst overpopulation-related global effects and for visible benefits to be derived. So the World Climate Conferences are also only nonsensical machinations because they do not bring effective measures, but only childish and idiotic decisions of uselessness. Because by these, the process cannot be stopped, which was irresponsibly cultivated by the mass of the overpopulation and their effects on nature, the climate, and the planet itself. The responsible persons of the governments, as well as the whole mankind itself, do not care about this fact. Consequently, they continue in the traditional framework, and slowly but surely the whole earthly mankind is led into a hellish catastrophe and into an unparalleled dying, which can extinguish very large masses of people, and it will. This is precisely the case if the emergency brake is not finally pulled in the form of a worldwide and rigorous burst stop. Because the massive overpopulation is the determining factor of all the evils rampant and degenerating on Earth, as well as climate change and all the increasing and ever-worsening natural disasters. Nevertheless, governments in the whole of humanity are not doing anything in this regard, but are still paying attention and listening to those pathologically mindless rulers and scientists and naive negators of truth who are so morbidly stupid that they can claim unscrupulously that there is no overpopulation on Earth and that there is room for billions more Earthlings. And this they do on the one hand out of their stupidity and inability to do so, because in their poverty of consciousness, intellect, and reason, they are not able to perceive the effective reality and its truth, and also not to understand it. On the other hand, these weak intelligentsia are not capable of correctly realizing the effective facts. Consequently, they cannot grasp them in a real way and cannot judge them. And this, in turn, because they place themselves in the foreground in their weakness of intelligence, intellect, and reason, and want to shine and make themselves important to the population with nonsensical and untruthful better knowledge and magnanimousness. But it is also a fact that such unscrupulous and irresponsible know-it-alls, alleged experts and big mouths make unilaterally assertive misrepresentations about overpopulation and its worldwide consequences, such as the fact that billions more people could still be born on Earth, and that the whole problem has to be considered and judged solely in terms of a wrong distribution of food and resources, etc. The fact is that the problem of overpopulation is not only a matter of the distribution of food and resources, but also of the fact that it is also a matter of the fact that the problem of overpopulation is not only a matter of the problem of the world's population, but also of the fact that it is a matter of the problem of the world's population. The facts of reality and its truth, which in many ways have catastrophic consequences for nature and its fauna and flora, as well as for the climate, the whole planet, and also for terrestrial mankind, are effectively being ignored and simply thoughtlessly and irresponsibly wiped under the table. And how this is done in a precarious and irresponsible way is also proven by an article that appeared in the consumer journal Saldo, number 17, 22nd of October 2014, in connection with a film entitled Population Boom by Werner Buthe, which quite obviously denies all the catastrophic effects that emerge from overpopulation. With what is written in this article, as apparently also in his film, Werner Butte denies that through the overpopulation effects in general for the world, the climate, the whole human race, and nature with all its vegetable as well as animal and Getiertian forms of life, etc., destructive and destructive factors were produced and continue to appear. For how else would he arrive at his statement? Environmental pollution also has little to do with overpopulation. Well, slowly but surely, nothing can be saved unless a worldwide and rigorous birth stop and effective birth control is put in place to counter overpopulation madness, which could prevent the worst from happening with all the catastrophic consequences of overpopulation. How short-sighted and blinded are those people who have to make a name for themselves by means of mistaken assumptions, assertions as well as by self-ins-lighting, and with stupid pamphlet-like and loudmouth articles that contradict effective reality and truth, as well as with films and lectures that twist the truth, etc., as is practiced especially in the industrialized countries. Effective reality is never mentioned, so the catastrophic effects that overpopulation has had for decades are irresponsibly concealed. Consequently, when senseless climate conferences are held, the current climate-induced state of the atmosphere is always the only one to be mentioned. But the effective causes are not mentioned, nor is it the case that the catastrophic state of the climate was caused solely by effects originating from overpopulation. If only carbon dioxide emissions are taken into account, carbon dioxide is considered to be the most harmful. Of the greenhouse gases and the main cause of climate change and global warming, the emissions caused by chimneys and chimneys, as well as by huge deforestation, wrongful forest fires, waste incineration, exhaust fumes of all kinds from passenger cars and trucks. If construction, mining and other machinery, ships, airplanes and motorized sports vehicles are thrown into the atmosphere in relation to the constantly increasing mass of overpopulation, it can be seen that this evil cannot be overcome by stupid climate conferences costing millions of dollars, francs and euros. This is precisely because decisions taken to reduce carbon dioxide emissions cannot be complied with in a certain period of time. This is because every year millions of new explosion motor vehicles with their emissions pollute and poison the atmosphere even more, as is the case with new houses, buildings, and factories that have to be heated or operated on the one hand. Coal-fired power plants also play a very important role in this, generating electrical energy and throwing vast amounts of emissions into the atmosphere. It is also not taken into account that every year around 100 million new Earthlings are born and thus drive up the overpopulation further, whereby the number and the ratio of the overpopulation growth, of course, constantly increases. If there are currently 100 million new Earthlings born each year, this number increases according to how many people return to sexual maturity and produce offspring. So soon, not 100 but 101 million, or their 102 million people will be born and will overpopulate Earth even faster and faster. This means, however, that more and more food and energy as well as Earth resources are needed, thus more and more intensive agriculture and gardening has to be carried out. But this is only possible by applying chemical toxins for the growth and protection of natural foods, such as vegetables, berries, herbs, fruit and mushrooms, etc., and infecting everything with the toxic substances, whereby people become suffering and decay serious diseases such as cancer. However, this also has a very severe impact on nature and its fauna and flora, such as killing and destroying useful insects and terrestrial organisms that are vital to nature, as well as destroying habitats and feeding places for animals, various animals, and birds. In terms of birds alone, around 500 million birds have been lost in Europe alone in the last 30 years, with various species close to extinction. And all this only by the chemical-intensive modern land and garden cultivation, which came off as a malicious effect of the overpopulation, likewise as well as the enormous environmental pollution. So it really wonders how great and workable a person's intellect and reason still are when he seriously claims that environmental pollution has nothing to do with overpopulation. In this respect, we should only think once of the waste pits, which in many countries are rotting and smoking as well as gigantic, whose smoke and stench pollute the atmosphere. This, too, is a catastrophic effect of overpopulation. For it is this, after all, which first and foremost and ultimately produces all the immense masses of waste that is generated worldwide every year in the billions of tons and pollutes the environment. This also applies to the various plastics, whereby plastic in particular endangers the lives of many animals and of various animals in fields, meadows, corridors, floodplains, and forests, as well as of birds, fish, and other aquatic organisms. Plastics rot very slowly, and the microorganisms that are still known today are not capable of completely decomposing plastics. Certain plastic bottles, plastic ducks, or disposable diapers, for example, take about 450 to 600 years to decompose. Plastic is biologically inert, that is to say, very stable and insoluble, and therefore hardly subject to mineralization. Although microplastic particles are continuously reduced in size, they are not completely degraded. A tremendous accumulation of plastics can be observed today in oceans, lakes, beaches, roadsides, sea vortexes, and sediments all over the world, with the oceans in particular being plastic and all sorts of rubbish dumps, created from consumer waste products that emerge as effects from overpopulation. So in many places, the oceans become more and more plastic collection points where plankton should be. The seas are large, but they still cannot swallow all the waste products created by overpopulation. After decades of wild garbage disposal, that is, throwing garbage and refuse into the seas, they spit the garbage out again at the feet of the growing overpopulation. The sand on the beaches has long since turned into plastic. Today it is possible to produce plastic from fat using slaughterhouse waste, but this is not ethically correct because animals must continue to be killed nonsensibly. About 20 years ago, a cargo of plastic ducks left Hong Kong on board a Chinese freighter. Since then, they have been swimming through the oceans and washing up on coasts all over the world. So copies stranded in England, others at the east coast of America, again others in Japan, and some even in the eternal ice. Imagine this journey. They first give a funny picture, these squeaky ducks on a long journey. And these Chinese ducks are only a tiny part of the plastic waste in the seas. Nobody can say exactly how much plastic waste has already accumulated in the sea worldwide. The fact is, however, that the effects are becoming more and more blatant as a result of the growing overpopulation and its waste and refuse rage. In addition, the existing waste does not simply dissolve, but takes a very long time to do so, up to 600 years. It was only after this time that nature dissolved even the most stubborn fishing net and leveled it with the seabed. This means, however, that the seabed will also soon be partly made of plastic. The fatal thing about any plastic is that it can hardly be biologically degraded, because in fact it is only crushed into ever smaller pieces, as a result of which it is no longer perceived optically, but does not disappear, but continues to exist. Microplastics in particular pose a very great danger, and tonnages of them swim around in the oceans, and they are already increasingly becoming an uncanny threat. The huge quantities of plastic waste have already begun to decompose into microparticles, thanks to salt water and solar radiation. The microplastic thus consists of particles smaller than the diameter of a hair, and it is already detectable worldwide in many places in water, sand, and sediment on the seabed. Microplastics are tiny particles found not only in the stomachs of shellfish, but also in their tissues and body fluids. The long-term consequences are obvious. It is also certain that the microplastics also distribute the other pollutants contained in the plastic, such as plasticizers and solvents, much more strongly and also impregnate the water. Some of these substances have a hormonal effect, which means that male fish already suffer more from infertility and hermaphroditus. To all abundance contribute not only these anyway, in the plastic contained pollutants to the poisoning of the sea life, but also many other waste substances, such as the fact that plastic in the sea acts like a magnet that absorbs and sucks up water-repellent chemicals. Sea creatures are poisoned with plastic waste, but many have already died and continue to die from other toxic substances. In some marine areas, 6 times more plastic parts swim than plankton. So many sea dwellers eat the plastic. Turtles, for example, hold plastic bags for jellyfish and eat them, as well as seabirds that swallow smaller plastic parts floating on the surface. One of the consequences of this is intestinal obstruction, which leads to death. Very many waterfowl strangle themselves if they use plastic cords with the nest construction. Other marine creatures, on the other hand, end up in so-called six-pack rings or in lost fishing nets, which are known as ghost nets. Plastic is washed up on every beach in the world, especially after storms. The largest plastic and garbage dump in the world is located northeast of Hawaii and bears the name Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The large Pacific Garbage Heap, or the most famous garbage strudel in the world, is about 1.5 million square kilometers in size, and it is not the only one of its kind. The garbage that can be perceived on the surface of the water is what can be seen because most of it lies on the seabed and in the whirlpools. In European sea sections, up to 100,000 pieces of waste visible to the naked eye were counted on a square kilometer of seabed, and in Indonesia the figure was as high as around 700,000. Garbage dumped in the North Sea mostly comes from fishing and shipping, but there are many other sources of marine pollution. The rivers are also used to flush garbage into the sea or to blow it into the water from garbage dumps along the coasts. Many types of waste also come from people who dump or simply leave their rubbish on beaches, brooks, rivers, and lakes, just as they do in floodplains, fields, meadows, and forests. If only the North Sea is taken into account. It is found that about 20,000 tons of waste are disposed of there every year, despite the fact that dumping waste in the North and Baltic Seas has been officially banned since 1988. Worldwide, the problem of the lack of disposal and recycling systems is extremely dramatic because, on the one hand, neither the manufacturers of waste products nor the consumers who buy their food in environmentally polluting packaging want to pay for the rubbish produced in its proper disposal. Many irresponsible consumers regret every cent that should be raised for waste disposal, so every garbage is simply thrown into the environment without hesitation. This is the reason why roadsides are so often littered with all kinds of waste and rubbish, even with filled rubbish sacks, that it stinks to heaven, which the criminal offenders do not care about, because they can save a few cents for the disposal of their rubbish. Therefore, a whole range of regional and global strategies would be needed to contain the land and marine waste catastrophe, as well as global human awareness of the explosive nature of the problem. By the garbage dumping in the free nature, all animals and all get TA, as well as the necessary soil organisms and the vital insects, are impaired and destroyed in their health and in their existence. It is a fact that Earth is facing the greatest death of amphibians. Animals, vertebrates, birds, reptiles, fish, and other marine creatures, as well as soil organisms and insects in the history of the planet. This mass extinction is caused by the irresponsible treatment of nature by human beings, both through pollution caused by overpopulation and through the use of countless toxic substances in the cultivation of vegetables, grains, fruit, etc. More than 1,000 species of animals, animals, birds, fish, and other marine life are acutely threatened by man's guilt or by all the many destructive effects of overpopulation. Throughout the history of the planet, only great natural catastrophes have eradicated so quickly many creatures, of many genera and species, as is the case in modern times through human guilt, precisely through all the negative and even criminal effects and machinations of overpopulation. Bees, for example, like other species, play a very important role in the ecosystem of the planet, as do thousands of animal, geological, soil, and insect species, many of which are threatened with extinction. Large vertebrates, such as the Sumatran tiger, are most threatened with extinction, but so are many other genera and species of living creatures. The rapid decay of various life-form populations is taking place at alarming rates, and there is a real threat of mass extinction unless something is finally done about it, which can only be in the sense that the growth of overpopulation is reduced to a reasonable level by a rigorous birth stop and a decisive birth control. The normal state for Earth would be 529 million, or at most 11 billion. If this is not done sufficiently, then it will be the sixth time in the history of planet Earth that individual species will be wiped out so quickly. This trend of degenerated effects, manifested by the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation, is ultimately causing very serious harm to all of terrestrial mankind. Analyses have shown that the reduction of species worldwide is shocking and is constantly increasing. If more than 320 terrestrial vertebrates have become extinct since 1500, the remaining species show an average decrease in their population of about 30%. For invertebrates, too, the situation looks bleak in a similar way. In two-thirds of these cases, the population of various genera and species is shrinking more and more, currently by about 50%. Even if the different biological genera and species on Earth are currently very diverse, and the so-called biodiversity was probably only slightly higher, it looks very gloomy and even evil on the future horizon, namely that 1 to 5 species die out every year. Even if it is usual in the course of evolution processes and by all earthly change, etc., that 1 to 3 species, such as plants, animals, vertebrates, soil organisms, insects, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles die out per year. This cannot be compared in any way with what happens by the effects of overpopulation on nature and its fauna and flora. Today, the human factor, with its irresponsible overpopulation and its degenerated effects, plays the decisive role. As a result, the usual rate of extinction of 1 to 3 species has increased to more than 1,000 extinct species per year. Climate change also plays a certain role as a cause, but it is also an effect that is attributed to the mass overpopulation and its effects. So the increased extinction of plants, animals, and gems, as well as of other living beings, can also be defined as a phenomenon that is to be defined as a human-made phenomenon. But this is a fact that is ignored both by the responsible rulers of all states and by the majority of earthly mankind. In the past, asteroid or comet impacts and massive volcanic eruptions were the main causes of the extinction of animals and gems. Today, however, man is to blame for this on Earth with his overpopulation and the resulting degenerated effects. Because with his machinations which endanger fauna and flora, he causes a similar influence on nature and the climate, whereby one devastating natural catastrophe after the other is caused. When vertebrates are considered, about 35% are threatened with extinction, as large animals in particular are particularly at risk, as demonstrated by the past mass extinction of dinosaurs and other large animals. Usually large animals have low growth rates in their population, as they usually produce few offspring and require large habitats to maintain their numbers, depending on their genus and species. Furthermore, whole regions are very quickly infested by pests when no big animals live anymore. This also causes diseases and epidemics to spread much more quickly, which are transmitted by the pest to animals and many other animals. This also has serious consequences for humans, as there is an increased risk of infection with these pathogens and epidemics. However, it must be clear that not only large animals have a very great influence on the health of humans, as well as fauna and flora, because just as valuable are also various insects, such as bees, which are important as pollinators of fruit and other flowers. If all the important bees and other pollinator insects were not there, it would not be possible for so many plants to be pollinated, providing people with healthy natural food. In addition, there is also the fact that all the useful insects also contribute to human health in other ways. In fact, they are immensely important for a functioning ecosystem because insects are part of the functioning nutrient cycles, and they also ensure the rapid decomposition of organic waste. So it is inevitable that the people of Earth should also focus their attention on the threat of mass extinction in order to protect nature and its fauna and flora more effectively. However, it must be said that there is no single solution to this global problem, because depending on the area and situation, the individual situation must be analyzed and a solution found, because only in this way can the mass extinction of plant, animal, and geological species be prevented. A further evil that degenerated effects are the rainforest clearings, because by growing of the overpopulation on the one hand, ever more place is needed for agriculture and horticulture and plantations. On the other hand, in addition, noble woods for the wood industry, which manufactures with expensive noble wood, which is won from rainforests, living furniture, or dwellings. In the process, huge slash and burn operations are carried out irresponsibly, as a result of which huge amounts of CO2 and carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere, have a negative impact on the climate, and then settle in the water again. But the climate is also changing worldwide due to the danger of the rapid clearing of rainforests, which creates huge wastelands, especially in South America as well as Borneo and Sumatra. The destruction of the rainforest continues unabated and is therefore also the very dangerous destructive influence on the world climate. If only Borneo and Sumatra and the deforestation of their rainforests are considered, then the lowland rainforests on the two Indonesian islands, Borneo and Sumatra, will be completely destroyed by 2020 if deforestation continues as quickly as before. In the deforested and cleared areas, plantations with oil palms and fast-growing tree species, such as acacias, are cultivated in particular, with the majority of the products that emerge from them being produced for industrialized countries. The vast islands of Borneo and Sumatra are among the world's most important rainforest areas, which is why it would be necessary to create new protected areas in which forest clearance would have to be prohibited. Of the original forest areas of Borneo, which once covered 95% of the island, only half remains today. Between 2003 and 2007 alone, Borneo lost an average of 1.15 million hectares of forest each year. But Sumatra is also frightened by the numbers of forests that have disappeared, as the island lost about half of its forest area between 1985 and 2007. The fact is that so far an average of 550,000 hectares have been deforested or cleared every year. This means that in the past 2 decades, a forest the size of 88 football pitches has disappeared every single hour, often through illegal slash and burn. The situation on Borneo and Sumatra is indeed highly dramatic, because if the clear cutting is not stopped, within 2 decades, forests of global importance for climate protection and a fascinating biodiversity will be completely and irrevocably destroyed. Already now it is so far that there is hardly any chance of survival for the orangutan in the wild. Everything is completely devastated by burning and clear cutting, So it is an effective fact that the last primeval forests on Earth are disappearing at a rapid pace. This means, however, that the foreseeable catastrophe caused by the rapid disappearance of primeval forests is only a matter of time. The peat bog soil of the peat bog forests in Borneo and Sumatra is also a ticking time bomb because these islands are the most powerful regions in the world where the largest tropical peat bog forests are. The peat bog forests grow on thick layers of peat and store many times more carbon than the rainforests that grow on mineral soils do. So the destruction of peat bog forests is a ticking time bomb with regard to climate change. Because if these were ultimately also cleared, gigantic CO2 reserves stored in the soil would be released, which could no longer be offset by reductions in other areas. When these forests are burned or cleared, the carbon from the soil is released into the atmosphere in the form of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, CO2. And all this is due to the effects of the degenerated and irresponsible machinations that emerge from the overpopulation. Another catastrophic problem that arises as a result of the overpopulation is the overuse of drinking water, which is taken both above ground and as groundwater, and on which mankind on Earth is just as dependent as nature and its entire fauna and flora. In many regions, such as China, the USA, and Mexico, excessive use of groundwater has caused the groundwater level to fall to such an extent that it has very negative consequences. Soil subsidence and desiccation of wetlands, for example, or a deterioration in water quality may occur. Certain countries, such as Libya or Saudi Arabia, use so-called fossil groundwater reservoirs as sources of drinking water and for irrigation. These reservoirs were formed thousands of years ago when the climate in today's desert areas was even more humid. However, these groundwater reservoirs are no longer renewed by precipitation today. This, of course, means that drinking water is becoming increasingly scarce, especially because large corporations draw off water for their plantations of all kinds, drying out streams, small rivers, and lakes, while the population suffers and has to buy their drinking water, which has to be transported far away at a high price from water corporations. However, population growth also plays an important role because the larger the overpopulation, the more drinking water it needs. Industrialization and urbanization are also important factors here because on the one hand, industrially enormous quantities of water are consumed, while the water consumption of urban populations is generally much higher than that of rural populations. The world population is growing, and with it its need for everyday things, including water consumption. If industrialization, agriculture, horticulture, and plantations continue to pollute, overexploit, and poison the water supply, then by 2025, around 3 billion people will be suffering from a shortage of drinking water, with Africa and Asia at the forefront. In the coming years, global water consumption will rise by around 50% due to the annual increase in overpopulation. That is to say, around 100 million per year. Well, not only the lack of water is the big problem of humanity on Earth, but also the squandering of the available resources as well as their pollution, making them unusable forever. So there is a lack of resources, and there is also a waste and pollution to which climate change adds, and so everything interacts and drives the coming disaster forward. But the evil goes even further, because in addition, the self-cleaning powers of watercourses. Lakes and wetlands are destroyed by excessive water withdrawal and increasing construction, which constantly makes everything even worse and creates a rotating, inexorable, and destructive cycle. The consequences of this are that 1.5 million children die every year as a result of polluted water and poor hygiene conditions. If this is calculated on a daily basis, there are about 5,000 children who lose their lives as a result, not counting the adults who also die as a result of poor hygienic conditions and water pollution and water poisoning. It is also a fact that 1 in 3 people in the world already suffers from water shortages. It is estimated that 350,000 people die every year from the consequences of contaminated drinking water. Hunger, floods, etc. All this has always been the case, but such events are becoming more and more frequent, also as a result of climate change, droughts, and all kinds of natural disasters. Small farmers and cattle breeders in North Africa and the Sahel zone, as well as in Nigeria, Darfur, Chad, Kenya, Somalia, Mali, and Burkina Faso, have been suffering from water shortages for years. And this often happens because corporations dig up drinking water for people for their plantations and drain streams, rivers, and lakes. The truth is, moreover, that the load limits of ecosystems have long since been exceeded, for some of them are already irreparably polluted or destroyed, even destroyed. This inevitably leads to a global water crisis with very devastating consequences for billions of people. To counter this crisis means that much more attention and assistance must be given to protecting existing water from excessive use and pollution. These problems cannot, however, be solved simply by using sewage treatment plants, but only by ensuring that the water is managed in a sustainable way that is compatible with the environment and that there is no pollution. On the one hand, and that the commercial waste of huge quantities of water on the other is prevented. If the necessary hygiene is also taken into account, then there are around 3 billion people worldwide who do not have a sewage connection in their homes and so on. If, however, untreated sewage is returned to the natural cycle, not only nature and drinking water suffer, but also fauna, flora, and humans, because untreated sewage produces negative consequences all around and toxic substances, which impair all forms of life in their health. More than 1 billion people do not even have access to sanitation facilities, and many others do not have sufficient. In addition to access to clean drinking water as the most urgent problem, hygiene and thus sanitary facilities are another necessary requirement. In Europe, too, the wastewater problem is enormous, as entire regions, such as Romania or Portugal, etc., have to get by without adequate wastewater treatment. And if, for example, the rivers in China's south are considered, then one can no longer speak of rivers, but only of huge flowing cloacas, whose water can no longer even be used for irrigating the fields, because the poisons they contain cause all plants to die, quite apart from living creatures that die miserably from the broth. And if we look at the slums of the big cities, we see that they stand above a layer of groundwater so polluted by a broth of waste and by human and animal feces that the health of the inhabitants of these slums is seriously affected. But in various countries, there are no sewage treatment plants, so this evil cannot be remedied. An evil that continues to rise steadily in relation to overpopulation growth and cannot be contained. In addition to all the above, there are other drinking water problems, such as those caused by the sports and tourism industries. Sports and tourist facilities, such as football and golf courses, etc., are irrigated, as is a huge amount of good water for swimming pools. For example, according to technical calculations, a large golf course with about 18 holes consumes about 700,000 cubic meters of water per year, and thus the equivalent of about 1918 cubic meters, or 1,918,000 liters per day. This corresponds to an annual or daily water volume of a city with 15,000 inhabitants, assuming a direct consumption of 127 liters per day in person. This nonsensical action can, under certain circumstances, lead to a lowering of the groundwater level in the area in question, and even to the drying up of the entire region. Water is also wasted mercilessly in the arid regions of the Mediterranean. In some cases, water consumption there rises to over 90% of water reserves due to unsuitable irrigation systems. As an example, serve the Plastic Sea at the Andalusian Mediterranean coast, where among other things the Spanish strawberries are cultivated. Horticulture and agriculture have drained an entire river, but this is only a fraction of what is common in Spain in terms of water abuse. Throughout Spain, there are 500,000 illegally used wells from which groundwater is pumped, mainly by large agricultural enterprises. If a comparison is made with private and household water consumption, only a small amount of water is required. However, the effects of the degenerated measures, which inevitably result from overpopulation, go much further because if virtual water is considered, it is important that a certain amount of water is required for the production of products. However, if the water is diverted for production, it is lost for human consumption as drinking water. In the worst case, it leads to the overuse of rivers and lakes, as is the case with the Aral Sea, which was drained by the excessive water discharge. It goes without saying that water can be imported and exported, as well as what is needed. When water is exported, a country loses virtual water that is effectively present in melons, oranges, and citrus fruits, for example, but also in all kinds of other products, even in technical ones. But the same trade can mitigate both its own consequences and those of climate change. When a country imports goods, it also imports virtual water. Just like globalized trade, the cycles of large wind systems transport water from one part of Earth to another. The whole thing is referred to as natural and anthropogenic or man-made effects. In the case of wind, for example, we can speak of natural water transport, but in the case of water trade, we can speak of anthropogenic water transport. It is not done with a single major crisis worldwide because there are many small ones. Irresponsible on the one hand due to greed for money, and on the other hand, as a result of the degenerated machinations by the overpopulation, the water is simply stolen from the people, as it happens among other things in Israel, where the Palestinians in the West Bank, the water is dug up and the Jordan is drained. As it happens slowly but surely also with the Sea of Galilee, as it happened with the Aral Sea, which was pumped out for the irrigation of the Uzbek cotton fields until it dried up. And if you take the water consumption of Las Vegas, then it has to be pumped into the city from far outside the desert. In Spain, as has already been mentioned, the river water of the Ebro is wasted on strawberry fields, making the region slowly but surely the first desert in Europe. When Arizona is examined in the USA, a mining company is found in the dry Indian country pumping out the groundwater in order to be able to transport the coal, which is crushed, away through pipes. Everywhere in the world there are big crop failures due to lack of water, while in California the forests burn almost all year round. Water is absolutely vital for man, nature and its fauna and flora, but it is still used as a disgrace and wasted, polluted, and abused for purely commercial purposes. So many people suffer from water shortages and even die as a result. Even in times of war, water is a factor which the warring parties negotiate with each other with regard to the joint use of running waters. Nevertheless, water could soon become more than just a topic of conversation. It could also become an object of war itself, because water resources are being exploited more and more maliciously and commercially abused. In fact, it is already so far the case that open and regular warnings are given of this danger. But all words and warnings in this regard have been spoken into the wind. As was and continues to be the case with all predictions and prophecies, even though they have demonstrably been fulfilled in a frightening manner since the 1950s and continue to be fulfilled. Every explanation, however well-founded, and every prediction, however precise, is like a call to the desert to the responsible rulers and the majority of earthly mankind, where every note simply dies somewhere in its expanse without echo. In the case of rivers and lakes, the fronts are usually clear. because in principle, that state always has sovereignty over the waters adjacent to the country or over the source in its own country. If it is a border river or a border lake, the right of ownership usually applies on both sides up to the middle of the river. As a result, it usually does not matter which country is more powerful in terms of military forces. Of course, in times of war, as well as in private and commercial ways, there is always the danger and possibility that streams and rivers in particular are maliciously and selfishly diverted and diverted, conquered or even maliciously, criminally, and irresponsibly poisoned or otherwise contaminated. Of course, such conflicts may occur once again, but as a rule, it is difficult nowadays in relatively safe communities of states to invade foreign territory with impunity due to the decisions of the United Nations. Of course, it still happens again and again that great powers invade foreign states, as the U.S. Army's invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan proved to be the best example. Fortunately, however, these are rarities today, along with the country's internal guerrilla, revolution, and warlike actions that are constantly underway in dozens of countries around the world. It must also be said, however, that manipulation of streams, rivers and lakes has a boomerang effect on the polluter. Until ecological catastrophes are the consequences, as has been proven time and again since time immemorial, and has remained so to the present day. In the past 50 years, water consumption has risen more than twice as fast as the world's population has grown, with the massive expansion of irrigated horticulture and irrigated agriculture being very much to blame for this. This is in addition to the fact that more and more drinking water is being wasted for everything possible and impossible in the private lives of earthlings. The insanity of mass livestock farming, in which livestock are usually maltreated with antibiotics, and meat consumers develop antibiotic resistance, as a result of which many diseases and ailments, etc., can no longer or only with difficulty be cured, also consumes an enormous amount of water. As is the case with the slaughter of animals and feathered cattle, etc., in which huge amounts of animal and feathered cattle blood and excrement, etc., are washed away with water. In the industrial cultivation of cucumbers, tomatoes, strawberries, oranges, and other natural food products, about 70 to 90% of water consumption is required worldwide, depending on the country. Consequently, it is only possible for the population to buy their necessary drinking water at horrendous prices in bottles, etc., which again allows corporations, etc., to enrich themselves. If only Spain is taken as an example, which supplies the whole of Europe with fruit and vegetables throughout the year, then it has to be said that in this country so much water is wasted as nowhere else in Europe. And if we look at the artificially irrigated fields, we see that the majority of the water seeps away uselessly into the soil on the one hand, and evaporates equally uselessly due to solar radiation on the other. If mass livestock farming is finally considered, it should be mentioned that, for example, about 16,000 liters of water are needed to produce only 1 kilo of beef. The use of water in meat production is therefore particularly high, because a cow not only drinks a lot, but also eats a lot of grass, which in turn needs water to grow. And if this quantity is converted to 1 cattle and then to the approximately 2 billion cattle, which are bred worldwide in the mass animal husbandry as meat suppliers, then the quantity of water required for all animals can hardly be recorded anymore. The same applies to all other mass livestock farming, be it pigs, sheep, goats, calves, red deer, rabbits, etc., or poultry of all genera and species. Investments to protect water are lacking everywhere where it is wasted pointlessly. On the one hand, it is the governments that are to blame for not doing what is necessary and not enforcing it. On the other hand, however, it is also those masses of populations that consume useless and senseless amounts of water without the need for it. In commercial terms, Two, there is a great deal of guilt in various relationships, not only in the form of intensively cultivating plants that are especially dependent on water because they make a lot of money in the trade. Due to the growth of overpopulation and the rising standard of living, water consumption also rises massively. And if humans cover only 20% of their food with meat, water consumption for the corresponding meat production doubles horrendously. In the industrialized countries, as in most countries around the world, water is still generally cheap because it is subsidized by the state. This, while in other countries it is expensive and a very precious commodity for the populations, especially where large corporations maintain huge horticultural and agricultural facilities and vast plantations and steal water from the populations to irrigate them, making billions of dollars. Etc. Governments and all people worldwide should recognize the value of water and take rigorous measures to protect it, distribute it evenly, and make it accessible to the population. However, the calculation is not yet working because those responsible in the governments are not doing anything in this direction and do not recognize in their irresponsibility that nature cannot be put off and strikes back furiously faster than mankind can dream. The same applies to oil wells and natural gas storage facilities, which will dry up forever in the near future. Only with the facts mentioned so far can the nonsense of the film Population Boom be refuted, that the horror scenario overpopulation, poverty, resource scarcity, hunger, climate change is only based on the fact that the only problem is to be found in the redistribution and distribution of food and all resources, as Werner Boot claims. Contrary to this naive assertion is the demonstrable fact that all evil, negative, bad effects exist on all ecosystems of the planet, and thus also on the climate, nature, and its fauna and flora, as well as on the people of Earth, through population growth and therefore long since through overpopulation. Poverty is also a problem that Werner Boot views only one-sidedly, such as the fact that the poor have no or too little money, as well as no land of their own. The mistaken view that the poor lack their own land is not the fault of the rich alone, for most countries today have huge corporations and states, such as China, etc., which buy up foreign land all over the world to produce their own food, while the rulers who sell off the land expropriate or steal it from the population. On the other hand, it must also be considered that not every piece of land is suitable for food cultivation, because bare deserts and steppes, rocky mountains, villages, and towns cannot be used for food cultivation. This also applies to roads, factory and corporate sites, as well as airports, etc. And with regard to poverty, there is also the problem of unemployment, because the industrial economy, etc., cannot employ more people than it needs and is possible for, without being overstaffed, thereby suffering losses rather than profits and jeopardizing its existence. As far as hunger is concerned, however, Werner Boot must be proved right in this respect, because if food were distributed fairly throughout the world, hunger could be contained. This alone could combat and end world hunger if the 1 billion tons of food that consumers in the industrialized countries of Europe throw away uselessly every year were distributed fairly to the hungry. This is because, on the one hand, an idiotic consumption date tempts the consumers, because they live in the delusion that if this has almost or completely expired, the content can then no longer be enjoyed, which, however, corresponds nothing more than to a stupidly ill thinking. On the other hand, it is also the wastefulness that plays along when still good food is disposed or thrown away. If these billion tons of discarded food were distributed worldwide to the needy and hungry, they could be supplied in abundance. The fact is that the food of all kinds thrown away every year alone would feed the entire earthly human population of around 8.5 billion, 8 billion, 500 million, 2 to 3 times. If it is further rightly claimed that most resources are consumed by people in the industrialized countries, then that is true, and nothing can be said against that. But if it is then claimed that Africa is not overpopulated with 40 people per square kilometer, as opposed to 170 people per square kilometer in Western Europe, then that is a lie or a misjudgment of the facts. According to ancient calculations, which were made for planet Earth, only 529 million people are supposed to populate the planet, whereby in relation to a fertile piece of land, only 12 persons were calculated. And since in Africa, as elsewhere in the world, deserts, mountains and forests as well as primeval forests, and these are uninhabitable, it is easy to calculate that 40 people per square kilometer correspond to an overpopulation as well as 170 people per square kilometer in Western Europe. So it is morbidly stupid and irresponsible to say that even if the population of Africa quadruples, the population density will remain below that of Europe for a long time. Such a stupid portrayal is effectively much more than just marked by crazy stupidity. This does not change the fact, if it is correctly said, that the product-oriented society has become a consumer-oriented, stupid society. In this correct statement, however, it was forgotten to say that today's humanity, or rather its majority, is a profit-oriented society, which itself ignores poverty, suffering and misery, and even slave and human trafficking, child labor and murder, manslaughter, war and religious fanatic terror, as well as family needs, jealousy dramas, prostitution and torture, and all kinds of capital crimes, and does not want to see anything. And these two are all degenerations and outgrowths that emerge as degenerations from overpopulation and increase steadily in relation to population growth. So it is also a brainless and irresponsible desire to call for films dealing with the problem of overpopulation to be shelved. Thoughts with such desires are not only contemptuous of man, but also criminal and lacking in humanity, because thereby the overpopulation is further cultivated without hesitation. And documentary films which deny and trivialize overpopulation as a result of misconception and irresponsible disregard for reality and its truth should be banned outright, because they mislead humanity and further incite it to increase overpopulation. Even the crazy idea that deserted steppes and deserts could simply be populated by humans and that the problem of space could thus be solved testifies to the fact that it is not just thought, but simply uselessly called out into the world because it is necessary to consider all that is necessary to make steppes and deserts habitable at all, let alone fruitful for food cultivation. Werner Butti has given one-sided and unrealistic thought to his claims, for he has not recognized the effective fact that indeed a massive overpopulation has caused, is causing, and will continue to cause all problems on Earth. He has unilaterally strayed in his idea of distributive justice, and to the wealthy in the West who do not grant the same right to poor people who do not live in the West. But these are views that have nothing to do with the rapidly growing overpopulation that has demonstrably damaged all the planet's ecosystems to such an extent that some of them have already become irreparable. Of course, the better off of the world are in a number who have everything in their hands and in their power as regards industry and the rest of the economy, finances and resources. But it is not as it is claimed that this is not the reason for not talking about consumption, which is actually a world problem, because everything is being done unfairly and irresponsibly. This problem is discussed again and again all over the world. But all those responsible who would have the power to do something positive in this direction think only for themselves, for their own profit and their own good. Now another evil of the overpopulation has to be addressed, which Werner Butti does not address in his one-sided film, namely that dirty business is done with food, be it with vegetables, fruits, berries and fruits, or with meat and fish, etc., whereby the irresponsible criminals earn themselves stupid and stupid. The producers of natural foods are underpaid for their goods by the buyers. who then resell the products at heavily translated prices, often with up to several 100% profit, which the consumers, poor and rich, then have to pay. Child and slave labor is also used, while the children and slaves are physically and mentally maltreated and extremely miserably remunerated, if at all. These too are effects and excesses caused by actions and consequences resulting from the degenerated machinations of overpopulation. This also includes fishing in the seas, in which fishing quotas are systematically circumvented and overfishing of the seas is further promoted, with fish soon becoming so massively more expensive that no working-class family can still afford it, but only the rich. According to the latest calculations, 90% of all commercially exploited fish stocks around the globe are already overfished, with 61% being critically threatened with extinction. Particularly problematic and criminal with regard to overfishing are the illegal fishing and exploitation of the seas by so-called monster ships, not only with regard to fish, but also with regard to other marine organisms which serve as food for humans. The whole fishery is also being made to play games by killing creatures that are unsuitable for sale and consumption and throwing them back into the sea, or processing them for dog and cat food, etc. Certain fish are only cut away the dorsal fins, etc., and the creatures suffering from hellish pain are thrown back alive into the sea again. There is not a single species of fish or other marine life in the world that is not overfished and irresponsibly hunted as a result of the food needs of the vast overpopulation, with, as has already been mentioned, 61% currently close to extinction. And the hammer of stupidity and irresponsibility can be found not only among fishermen and fishing companies, but also among nutritionists who idiotically propagate that humans should eat fish at least once a week to cover the need for omega-3 fats, even though there are better alternatives, such as tree nuts and safflower oil, as well as the pear or avocado, which humans worldwide use for food. But there is no thought given to this either, nor to the fact that the fish and also various other sea creatures, which are caught with nets, suffocate in these miserably and painfully. And it is to be feared that it will be lucrative to finally rob the oceans completely, because the lack of conscience of human beings towards all living beings who can serve them as food is boundless, so that the majority of mankind does not care which genera and species of life forms they serve for food purposes are exterminated. And someone else should claim that the extermination of all the affected creatures is not due to the effects and excesses of the degenerated machinations of the overpopulation. Only a person who is no longer in a state of consolation and who profoundly misunderstands reality and its truth, or who goes along with it in a blindness to the truth, can claim this. Now, those fishing companies that equip and send out monster vessels for fishing are systematically circumventing the internationally established fishing rules in order to maximize their profits. Their approach is such that they frequently change the national flag on their monster ships every week, which indicates, in this way only supposedly, to which country the ship belongs. The trick here is that in this way, you can benefit under the flag of different countries instead of just your home country, which of course can drastically increase catch quotas. That is an undeniable fact, even if the European Fisheries Federation is opposed to it. A query to the Pléiaren Ptah, who for decades has had all processes on the oceans observed and registered by his people, etc., confirms this fact, as well as everything that has been addressed and performed so far in every respect. It is also confirmed that in Asia and on Southeast Asian fishing, vessels slaves have to do hard work involuntarily, are driven and beaten. According to a UN report, around 22,000 fishing slaves are currently being exploited on Southeast Asian fishing fleets, although according to Pléiaren investigations, the number of such slaves is even higher. The overfishing of the seas will soon lead to an even steeper decline in the remaining percentages of fish and other marine livestocks, which will be badly received by consumers who buy such seafood, because they will no longer be able to buy and pay for sea products as a result of horrendous prices. And consequently, it will only be up to the rich to enjoy products from the seas. Furthermore, with regard to the consequences of the degenerate and catastrophic machinations which continue to result from overpopulation, Europe is also involved in the whole disaster, in particular the European Union dictatorship. So not only are the efforts of the fishing industry being intensified worldwide by all countries, but also by the EU, despite the fact that, according to the FAO, catches are currently stagnating at 80 to 90 million tons per year, which is a clear sign that the seas are senselessly overfished. Almost everywhere in all seas and big lakes today, more fish are caught than can grow back naturally. The fact is that around the globe, 90% of all commercially exploited fish stocks must be conserved, and as already mentioned, more than 61% are overfished to their limits. The EU fishing fleet has played a decisive role in the whole disaster in terms of the exploitation of the seas, because it has long since ceased to fish only in its own waters. The truth is that the EU is a world champion in overfishing. If we look at the Mediterranean, we can see that 3/4 of its fish stocks are overfished, while more than 45% of the stocks in European Atlantic waters are overfished. As a result, the EU fishing fleet is increasingly switching to foreign waters, where it already catches about 25% of its catches. It is not only nature that is suffering, but it is also the local fishermen who cannot catch any more or less fish on the one hand, and who are deprived of their livelihood on the other. The consequence of this is that in certain countries, such as Asia and Africa, fishermen become criminals, bandits, thieves, blackmailers, kidnappers, pirates and robbers, and even murderers. Somalia has gained a particularly malignant fame as a result. So, as I said, even in the EU, fishing is completely out of control because it too has become involved in the fishing lobby and indulges in overfishing by maintaining fleets that are too large and by not adhering to quotas. But what can be expected of a dictatorship? It should also be noted that there are 2.5 times more fishing vessels in the world than would be necessary and sustainable for sustainable, rational, and responsible fishing. In the period 2003 to 2011 alone, the EU fleet thus brought twice as many fish and other marine life from the Northeast Atlantic as scientists had recommended. But that is not all, because in many places, illegal fishing as well as fish robbery by the monster fishing vessels are added. All of the above corresponds to only a few aspects that emerge as effects and evil, negative and dangerous, life-threatening and life-destroying outgrowths from all the degenerated measures of overpopulation, because many other factors could be taken into account and explained, because the whole thing is almost boundless and much worse than everything has been described with regard to the outgrowths. Effects and evils that emerge from overpopulation and that increase drastically as a result of further overpopulation growth. Sim-Yase Silver Star Center, the 11th of November 2014, 2347 HRS Billy.
I read your article, Edouard. What you have written here is factual, and I think it was long overdue and should have been written by you, because your remarks can open many people's eyes to what the overpopulation really brings with it in terms of evil effects and evil excesses. The matter of the EU dictatorship, which you mention in relation to the EU fishing fleet, is also very informative and probably unknown to many people in Europe and elsewhere in the world. However, there are still many factors that need to be addressed, but I think that what you explain are at least the most important things that need to be mentioned.
You read quickly, dear friend, because you only needed a little more than an hour. In the time you were reading, I could still get these 2 letters done here. But I want to add another article to this article, which I have already started here, but I have to finish it when I find time.
I am also interested in this article. When you have written it, Florina can pass it on to me so that I can read it too.
It would probably be good if I added this article to this conversation too, or what do you think?
Of course. I'd like to read what you've already written.
Sure, look, there's the 2 pages in the computer that I've already written. It is estimated that there is about half a page left that I want to finish in the next few days when I get to it, which is a bit difficult at the moment because I have a lot of other things to do.
Then I will start by reading what you have already written. Reads.
Modern piracy.
Somali pirates attack ships in the Gulf of Aden and kidnap the crews, for which they demand and receive high ransoms for their release. Security companies and insurance companies have thus found a new source of income, because they react to the piracy and confiscation of ships and the kidnapping of crew members and ship guests with special offers, and earn a lot of money with it. And piracy flourishes despite military protection and the avoidance of danger zones. The pirate crews are made up of all sorts of people who have become unemployed as a result of a lack of work, or who have been deprived of their livelihood through overfishing of the seas by fishing companies. So the pirates are first and foremost former fishermen and Civil War fighters. Consequently, the piracy and the ransom pressing, as well as the stealing and plundering, are done by such people, which on the one hand happens to earn a living, and on the other hand also to be able to enrich themselves. As far as Somali pirates are concerned, they have an important area in the Gulf of Aden for their raids, because their direct proximity to important shipping routes between Asia and Europe makes everything easy for them. As a rule, pirates are young men who have little prospect of a future in their country. So piracy offers them the opportunity to make a living, as was the case in earlier times, when the great pirates of the world's oceans were up to their necks. And the fact that piracy has been a game of a lot of money since ancient times, as it is today, is an undeniable fact. In ancient times, so-called cappa briefa were still issued, which were also used for piracy. A letter of marque was a document issued by a government to a private individual who was then entitled to go on a journey of marriages. This means that the captain had the mission and the right to board, capture, or sink foreign ships of another nation. The caper thus acted on the official orders of the state which had issued the letter of marque, and, in addition, the caper and his crew were offered protection in the ports of the nation issuing the letter of marque. In return, the captain was obliged to pay part of the loot, the so-called pinch, to the issuing state. On board, the portion of the loot or the proceeds from it, that is to say the prize money, was distributed among the crew members according to a fixed key. Letters of marque were issued in the 12th century to regulate the situation on the oceans, which until then had been practically lawless, although marqueering remained an accepted part of naval warfare until the 19th century. In principle, the Marshal's letter was used to separate naval warfare by order from piracy, which, however, sometimes led to captains using the Marshal's letter to engage in piracy on the side. First and foremost, merchant ships were the target of the privateer ships, whereby the letters of marque were issued for these ships in particular, when states wanted to strengthen their naval power in the short term or simply needed money. Such letters of marque were issued in particular by England, France, the Hanseatic cities, and the USA. With regard to the fact that too much money came from letters of marque and captains, the typical example of Elizabethan England, which Francis Drake and other captains recruited with letters of marque, probably serves best to weaken Spain on the one hand and to obtain financial means for the construction of their own large navy on the other hand by means of these letters. In this way, England also succeeded in winning nautically highly qualified captains of other nations. Furthermore, the means of the Caper Brief was partly used to prevent pirates from threatening their own ships. Well, not only in the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea, transports are threatened again and again, because both seas have to be crossed by every ship that wants to use the Suez Canal. The detour via South Africa's Cape of Good Hope would probably be much safer, but that would be more time-consuming and costly. However, there are now shipping companies again that are using the tried and tested route, which means they can escape the risk of a pirate attack in the Gulf of Aden. However, this means that the transit taxes for the operators of the Suez Canal are dwindling, damaging the Egyptian state, which is already in a rather precarious crisis after the fall of Mubarak and Morsi. The number of pirate attacks on merchant ships, etc., is quite high, with the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Somalia being the main focus of modern piracy in Africa. The psycho-terror of the pirates hits still some other ships than only merchant ships, because also private yachts, etc., are captured. The people kidnapped in the process are often held in captivity for months and become ill without receiving treatment with medications. Sometimes the prisoners are murdered too. When the pirates leave their harbours for a voyage of caporage, they are not afraid to be extremely brutal and murderous when boarding the ships. Seafaring and piracy have been closely linked since time immemorial. The reason why merchant ships can enter and caper is that a fully loaded ship is comparatively slow to manoeuvre and quickly immobile. Private yachts are not so cumbersome and easy to steer, but their manoeuvrability is of no use to them. Because many pirates launch their attacks with high-performance speedboats, consequently these ships are also easy to board, especially because the crews are forced to surrender by force of arms. When merchant ships or private yachts are not exactly on the move in an alliance, whereby they can protect and help each other, the crews usually remain on their own, a fact that pirates have known how to use since ancient times. Today's piracy, however, which not only takes place in the Gulf of Aden, but also partly on the world's oceans, has a lot to do with technology. Thus, the speed and ease of control of the ships that are attacked are of great importance, as are their armament and defense capabilities, which are therefore very important factors when an attack occurs. This is so very important because the pirates themselves are equipped with the most modern speedboats, but also with the latest modern weapons, which they use without hesitation, in the same way as the pirates of the last centuries have done in the past, by attacking and robbing coastal settlements while murdering. The modern pirates of modern times no longer sail with a skull and crossbones flag, or the so-called Jolly Roger on a caper cruise, as was the case in the old days. In the past, piracy was often carried out in such a way that ships were first flying a national flag until they approached the ships to be attacked. But when the opportunity arose to board a ship, a pirate flag was hoisted. The new modern pirates don't find this necessary anymore because they proceed completely different than the old piracy did. Modern pirates no longer wear cutlasses, but only standard knives and machetes, if any, and they are equipped with the most modern weapons. Modern pirates also have completely new objectives, namely extortion in relation to the need to buy human lives and ships. But this does not preclude certain pirates from stealing and selling shiploads in certain areas. Whereas in ancient times it was mostly about the cargoes of the ships and the private possessions of the crews, etc., today's modern piracy is in many cases a ransom extortion in the foreground. Ships and crews are detained until the owners or shipping companies pay the desired large amount of money, which can amount to millions of dollars, with the total annual loss amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. The details relating to the transfer of money and the exchange of captured crews and vessels must be strictly observed. And that this will work is something that professional intermediaries will have to do, working for and being remunerated for both the pirates and the owners of the ships and shipping companies. Of course, the ship's vaults are also robbed, which usually contain considerable sums of money, with which the wages or the remuneration of the ship's crew and the harbour dues must be paid. However, valuable parts of the ship's equipment that can be quickly dismantled are also of interest and use to the pirates. Attacks on ships usually take place at night, but not infrequently during the day, with the help of speedboats, as mentioned above. These boats reach such high speeds that they are superior to any cargo and merchant ship, cruise ship, oil tanker, or private yacht, affecting many different sectors of the economy. Piracy, which has brought much hardship, misery, mourning, damage and destruction since time immemorial, has never ceased, as the Piracy Reporting Centre, founded in 1993, which is open 24 hours a day, analyses all the irregularities that occur on the world's oceans with regard to piracy, etc., shows. However, the public media very rarely mention predatory incidents on the world's oceans, because such events are obviously not sensational enough. But if there is a report about it, then everything has been raised in such a way that it has a slightly exotic and pirate nostalgic aftertaste. It does not matter that the pirates not only use speedboats, which no other ship can escape from, but also that machine guns and bazookas are used for boarding, regardless of losses. Nowadays, there are small as well as large defensive measures against modern piracy. In this respect, the maritime trade routes around the Horn of Africa were already monitored at the end of 2001 as part of the military action Operation Enduring Freedom. The whole thing was connected with the attacks of the 11th of September and the subsequent War on Terrorism proclaimed by the USA. Specifically, later missions, such as the Operation Allied Provider at the end of 2008, were directed against piracy, which was aimed at protecting ships of the United Nations World Food Programme. In November 2008, the EU decided to provide security through Operation Atalanta, which was followed by further naval operations, resulting in multiple defences against pirate attacks and the deployment of ships and pirate crews. But also, the cargo ships threatened by pirates have possibilities to protect themselves. For example, with water and sound cannons, as well as by a kind of high-voltage fence, which is stretched around the ship. However, private security teams are also hired to accompany the ships. Of course, these are only individual measures that are not necessarily effective. In principle, the danger of piracy remains on the world's oceans. And consequently, the world will remain busy on pirate ships even without a Black Skull flag, at least for such a long time, until finally something gripping is done about it. Unfortunately, however, false humanitarianism is only too well known, through which those responsible in every field laxly and inadequately take action against criminality and crime because they are all misled, as are large sections of the world's population, who see everything in the vapor of trivialization through false humanism, propaganda by groups and organizations that think in terms of false humanitarianism and act far too humanitarian. Finally, it must be said that not only the sea area off Somalia is considered a trade route very endangered by pirates, and this also in the 21st century, because pirates also threaten other sea areas around the world where tankers, container ships, and freighters, as well as other ships, are attacked and robbed, and even their crews murdered. There is also the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia, as well as South American ports and the West African coast near Nigeria and Guinea, where attacks on merchant ships and cruise ships, etc., occur virtually regularly. However, the Gulf of Aden off Somalia remains a special high-risk area, although the number of successful attacks there has fallen drastically. And the fact that the number of pirate attacks has decreased there is often due to the fact that private security services take over the protection of ships. As a rule, battle-experienced mercenaries are hired by international security companies that have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, they shall also include advisors and training personnel on board ships to instruct their masters and crews in the proper conduct of any attack as they prepare seafarers for possible hostage-taking. Nevertheless, the whole of shipping is a very dangerous business in the context of modern piracy, as the pirates attack with modern weapons such as bazookas, assault rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns. They have no scruples or compassion, which is why they accept killing and do not shy away from torture and imprisonment of crews and passengers. Basically, they also rob entire ships and extort ransoms, whereby the pressure on the shipping companies is relentlessly increased more and more. The following excerpt, among others, can be found on the internet with regard to piracy.
According to a recent study by the World Bank, the United Nations, and Interpol, worldwide piracy causes annual damage of around 18 billion euros. Between 2005 and 2012, up to $413 million in ransom had been collected from pirates, about $2.7 million per robbery. The pirate gangs also use their income to upgrade. They buy modern weapons, better engines, and faster boats. They are now specifically hunting ships without armed protection. Their victims, therefore, increasingly include ships and boats from states whose shipping companies cannot afford security guards. At the moment, around 50 seamen are still being held hostage off Somalia. They mainly come from Asia. Some have been waiting more than 3 years for their release. Guards on board shall spare the crews of German ships such a fate.
Sim Yaseh, Silver Star Center, the 14th of November 2014, 1822. Billy.
Also, this article is well written, at least once what I have read. So I assume that the rest will also be in the same good framework, which Florina can then forward to me and which you can then insert completely into our conversation.
Glad to hear it. But now I would like to ask you if you are following the matter with Rosetta, who carries the probe Philae inside her, which is to be landed tomorrow on the comet Chury.
Chury is only the abbreviation for the comet 67P/Churyumov-Gerasimenko, as it is called by earthly scientists. On this matter, we must say that we are following it with great interest and admit that it is an extremely respectable achievement on the part of the scientists who have made the whole company possible from the ground up. This, starting with the construction and manufacture of the Rosetta carrier probe, the correction maneuvers and the actual Philae landing probe, up to all the extremely precise calculations, etc., which made it possible to bring Rosetta to its destination. In this regard, we have also made extremely precise calculations, as well as the fissured comet in view, which in relation to its very hard but dust-covered surface for the probe, hardly or only extremely hardly offers possibilities to penetrate with drilling rigs into the ground. These facts alone indicate that the comet does not correspond to the forms of an ice and dirt ball commonly assumed by earthly scientists. In addition, our very precisely calculated landing coordinates have shown that tomorrow the landing probe, Philae, will unfortunately be placed in unfavorable terrain and will tilt, which is why it will not be able to take up its activity within the planned scope from this point of view. But if now all achievements of those earthly scientists, etc., are considered, who worked on the whole project, then it has to be said that they have finally achieved a historical achievement. Because tomorrow's landing of the probe Philae on the comet called 67P/Chkurjumov-Gerasimenko will without any doubt correspond to a master achievement.
It's a pity that something goes wrong, but the fact of the masterpiece, as you call it, remains. And that's what it is anyway, even if in the end everything doesn't go as hoped with the probe work.
There's nothing wrong with that.
That's right. What do you actually think of all this, that the West is again considering Russia, as it has done since time immemorial, and especially again today, as an opponent? I have made myself smart about it and read some in a very instructive newspaper article, as well as collected other important information, which are probably unknown to the so-called normal citizen. So I have acquired some knowledge about the history of Russia, and that Russia has been feared and denigrated by Western states, and they're powerful from time immemorial. Even the Cold War was shaped when around the world the non-communist states roared, "Turn away from Russia." Today, too, the declared opponents of Russia have again been given much room for agitation, in particular by the dictatorship of the European Union, as well as by the USA and the Russian hate criers in Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic, who accuse the Russian people of being belligerent. Obviously, as a result of fear and cowardice, as well as an abysmally wrong rhetoric of the EU dictatorship rulers, whereby the rulers of Germany play a special role in an idiotic and criminal as well as irresponsible manner, the Cold War is being worked towards erroneously making reality again.
What you're saying is actually back today. But the whole thing has its roots much deeper than is generally recognizable for the unoriented normal person, because everything has been well-founded since time immemorial. As you say, with opponents of Russia, whereby the opposition has carried itself far around, especially in the West, up to the present time of the 21st century. Thus, the Cold War was also a pronounced degeneration of the contrast between Russia and the West, as well as other states that pacted with the West. In the last century, for ideological reasons, the hostility had been continued and rebuilt, with capitalism being the main cause in the Western camp and communism being the main cause in Russia and its member states. But that was only an irresponsible act, which proved to be so when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, when the small former Soviet republics very quickly fell away from Russia and turned to the West Europe and the USA. However, this inevitably meant that the former Eastern Bloc states, which turned to the West, felt more and more oppressed by Russia and resisted Russia's interference in their territories, sometimes by force, which led to various acts of war with the Russians in the former Soviet states.
The Cold War, I have orientated myself, was nothing other than a consequence of the traditional hostility between the Western states and Russia, whereby I think that since time immemorial the evil relationship between these two fronts was constantly controlled by antagonists and power-hungry, fundamentally from Europe and the USA, of course. This inevitably created mistrust between Russia and the Western states, and I think that the different religions from the East and West were also involved in this, dirty and creating unrest. It is also necessary to consider the fact that there were very different and deep-rooted cultural differences between Western and Russian religious and popular cultures, as is still the case today, and that hostilities have therefore been part of the agenda since time immemorial in this respect. 2. Due to lack of understanding and hatred of nations, etc., if it is considered that a single person, like for example a religious or political ruler, can stir up whole masses of people with mad delusions and bring them to his side, as is also the case today with the IS or Islamist State in Syria and Iraq, then this is not surprising. And what you are saying about the fact that states freed by the Soviet Union turned and continue to turn to the West, to the USA and especially to the EU dictatorship, instead of preserving their gained freedom and independence, respectively. This was and is a new reason for distrust and hostility towards Russia, which naturally sees itself snubbed and feels cut off from the whole Western world, as was the case earlier as a result of the Tartar rule, which, to my knowledge, if I remember correctly, came into play in the 11th century and which did not end again until the 15th century, when Moscow's power or empire was formed. And because this power quickly spread territorially after its establishment, it was again a new reason for the Western states to create fear and a new enemy image of Russia and its people, who were particularly in the 16th century as barbaric and brutal reputation. And since the East Christian Church and the West Christian Church were in clinch with each other, and since Russian politics and those of the West did not coincide, Russia was stylized as a tyrannical enemy both in terms of Christianity and Western politics, as well as in terms of Western military affairs. The fact that Russia was then accused of imperialism was the result of the fact that in the Balkans, as well as in Asia, it gathered like-minded people around it in various states, which of course was contrary to the interests of the Western powers with regard to their interests. In addition, Western powers interfered in Russia's internal affairs, and the internal constitution was criticized. Russia's expansionism was also denounced, while that of the West was not even mentioned, especially that which the USA has afforded since time immemorial, which settled in many countries worldwide and made them dependent on them, which is still done today. Russia has probably always been a country that was classified as autocratic, that is to say that the nominal or form of power was held by a ruler. This was still the case in the late 19th century, when more and more states in Europe were trying to allow the participation of the individual citizen in political events, while Russia continued to adhere to the old autocracy system, which of course was badly compatible with the conscious, social, and economic dynamics that gripped Russia. In 1917, everything led to the revolution, which inevitably led to a different political path than the Western world had hoped for. As a result, Russia and the Eastern states became even more alienated than before, which worsened when the Second World War came to an end and the occupation of Eastern Germany took place, which was finally followed by the Cold War. I also orientated myself further on this, but I already knew otherwise that with the collapse of the superpower USSR and the end of the ideological contradiction, the relationship between the Western states changed for a short time. With the end of the Soviet Union, it lost the essence of fear for the West, because from the 1990s, Russia was very weakened in every respect, and therefore no longer regarded as a powerful enemy. This led to a strange form of sympathy for the new Russia in the West. But it lasted only until Vladimir Putin came to power, who was said to be claiming great power status for his country again, which may or may not be the case. Already since his first inauguration, Russia has been proclaimed by the West, especially by the USA and the EU dictatorship, as an enemy again, and regarded as a potential opponent. I regard this as a negligent and criminal act, because it can lead to a complete isolation of Russia again, as well as a new Cold War, but real new acts of war cannot be ruled out either. Although Putin's policy towards Crimea and Ukraine is to be criticized in a reasonable way because all action is not right, this does not mean that the USA and the EU dictatorship must impose idiotic sanctions against Russia, which damage the Russian people and the economy, but which can also create counter-sanctions which, in turn, can hit the populations of Europe and the USA and their economies very hard. Seen correctly, In this and other relations, the powerful of the EU dictatorship negligently ignore foreign policy interests in relation to Russia, and even endanger the already fragile world peace. For the EU dictatorship and the USA, as for all other states, it is a matter of asserting their own interests by hook or by crook, whereby violence, illogicalness, and coercion are regarded as completely wrong means, but as absolutely just and right. All the sublime and beautiful words of those in power who are guilty and responsible in this relationship are no more than lies and deception. For truthfully, they are all concerned only with their maintenance of power, and that without the people being able to give them guidelines. But the fact is that with all the lies and deceit that keep the people underage and small, all Western states and Russia as well as the whole world in one boat, therefore all use the same oars and have to steer the boat in the same direction. So all the politicians and other rulers, all the military as well as all scientists, religions and all peoples are called upon to promote true peace. Which means, however, that all, namely completely all existing escalations in every respect are ended and the entire state of the world is normalized on a peaceful basis. That's my opinion.
Which I can only agree with. But now, dear friend, after your long explanation, it is time again for me to say goodbye and say, goodbye, dear friend.
Likewise, dear friend, goodbye.